Hi, welcome back, everybody. We're going to get started with the midday session. It's going to be moderated by Michael Gregory. Speakers are Gerry Alabone, Géraldine Bidault, and Marie Dubost. I'm just going to introduce Michael Gregory, and then I'll turn it over to him. Fascinated by the picture frame as a decorative arts object that makes links between painting and context, Michael has documented pictures in their frames in museums and collections worldwide. Michael maintains a frames and framing database for the information and images he has gathered. As a frame historian with informed taste and combining his skills as a craftsman, Michael advises museums and private collectors on historically appropriate frames for a wide range of paintings from old masters to contemporary. Michael Gregory studied carving in wood and stone, gilding, and conservation of decorative surfaces at City and Guilds of London Art School. After graduation, he joined Arnold Wiggins and Sons, where he worked alongside Jim Wiggins as a carver before taking over the management of Wiggins. He has advised museums and framed paintings worldwide, including the National Gallery of London, the Victoria and Albert Museum, National Gallery of Art Washington, the Getty, Huntington Museum and Library, Yale Center for British Art, Art Institute of Chicago, and Kimball Art Museum. He has held the royal ward as picture frame maker to Her Majesty the Queen Mother and Her Majesty the Queen since 1991. And I had the opportunity to meet Michael in London this summer, and he was kind enough to show me around Wiggins. And it was just a wonderful, lovely experience, which I thank him for. I think the collections and storage at Wiggins equals any museum I've ever worked at. So thank you so much, Michael, for being here today and for moderating this next panel. I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Judith. Can you hear me okay? Does it sound good?
Yep, sounds great.
Good. Well, that was far too long an introduction and far too generous. But and it was great meeting you whilst you were over in London. It's super that you're hosting this frame conference with a backdrop of your wonderful collection of frames in Toronto. But welcome everybody to the second midday, or indeed whatever time of day it is for you, because there's people from, I think, around the world taking part in this conference. So the second session of Many Lives, Picture Frames in Context. And it's exciting we've got so many people joining us. So we've got three diverse papers ranging from the English 17th century auricular frames to historical research on documented 18th century French frames, and a paper on technique of the Reparure and how it enriches the gilded object. So first we'll hand over to Gerry Alabone. Gerry is the Senior Curator of Furniture and Frames at the National Trust. His full biography is there, as Juliet says, for you to read and look at. And he lectures at the Sitting Guilds of London Art School, where I was a student a long time ago. So there's a bit of a shout out for Sitting Guilds. It has a great conservation, carving and gilding program. Gerry's talk is Mary Ashfield, 17th century London frame maker. So over to you, Gerry.
Okay, thanks very much for the introduction. I'm a conservator, as you know, rather than a curator, I should point out. And thanks very much for the opportunity of speaking to the conference. Perhaps surprisingly, Mary Ashfield was one of at least three female professional frame makers practicing in London around the 1670s. In this paper, I'll consider what can be deduced from her practice and the significant group of frames that was made by her. These are some of the most fashionable contemporary frames made from an elite market, and this was done in a society where professional women were rare. One of her newly attributed full-length carved oak frames was included in the Art Gallery of Ontario's recent exhibition, making her mark the history of women artists in Europe, 1400 to 1800. The majority of these frames, thought to be by Ashfield, retain their original paintings and can be seen in English castles, houses, and several London Inns of Court. Others have travelled more widely, and some have been reused, for example, at the Rijksmuseum, or are currently empty, including one now in the Thompson Frames collection of the Art Gallery of Ontario, which is the one on this slide. Ashfield has been selected as a case study as there are a relatively high number of over 30 datable frames, seemingly all made within the period of less than a decade, from 1669 to the mid-1670s. And interestingly, all of these are in the fashionable auricular style. Sadly, there's no biography of Mary Ashfield, but I'll consider what is known of the professional context within which she worked, and I'll propose several patterns of the richly carved and gilded frames that she made. And I'll characterize the frames and propose a chronology. My research is based on my images collection of over 800 English auricular style frames dating between the 1630s and the 1680s. I physically examined as many of the Ashfield frames as possible, using stylistic and technical analysis of their materials, joinery, carving, and gilding. I'll consider these as well as changes made to the frames over time. There remain many gaps and uncertainties, but in the absence of much documentary evidence, I present this material and technical research to try and progress our understanding of the frames and the trade during this period. The modern story starts in the 1950s when James Halgago, keeper of prints and pictures at the Guildhall of the City of London, published an article about the set of 22 full-length portraits of the fire judges who were appointed after the Great Fire of London in 1666. Having researched the 17th century cash books, Halgago listed 3 women among the 5 frame makers paid for providing carved and gilded frames for the set between 1671 and 1675. These 3 women were Mary Ashfield, Mary Flushier, and Mary Dorrell. More recently, Jacob Simon, in his online Directory of British Framemakers and his article on women in picture framing in the Frame blog, mentions that 2 of these surnames have been linked to men working in related professions at the time. Edmund Ashfield was a noted pastel portraitist, and Tobias Flechiers, there's many different variations of his family spelling, problematically, was born in The Hague and was a painter and frame maker in the West End of London during the period. Mary Dorrell is not otherwise known, unless she's the Mrs. Dorrell recorded as making frames for the Earl of Leicester in 1678. Neil Jafares, in the Dictionary of Pastelists before 1800, has established Edmund Ashfield's dates as 1640 to 1679. Jafares also thinks Mary may have been married to Edmund and framed his pastel portraits. The current Tate exhibition, Now You See Us, Women Artists in Britain 1520 to 1920, notes that female painters of the period were typically daughters, sisters, or wives of male painters. Simon also mentions that the wife of George Geldof, one of Charles I's frame makers, has gilded his frames. And perhaps Mary Ashfield's training, like other little-known professional women at the time, was in a family business. Mary's maiden name is not known. However, she supplied other painters, including John Michael Wright, who taught Edmund Ashfield, and Edward Luttrell, who in turn had probably been taught by Edmund. Edmund Ashfield started to use pastel systematically from 1669 until 1676, making highly accomplished portraits that were approximately 10 by 3/4 by 8 3/4 inches, or 270 by 220 millimeters, larger than miniatures and smaller than portraits in oil, their size being limited by pastel's requirements for expensive glazing. His studio was in Lincoln's Inn Fields, well situated between the city and Westminster. And this slide shows the earliest known portrait by Edmund Ashfield, made in 1669 of Charlotte Boyle, signed and dated EAF 69. This, like most English frames of the period, has been over-gilded and the bottom lower central mask is a restoration. However, pastels as a type of painting often retain their original frames, as the pictures are particularly vulnerable to damage when removed from their glazed frames. Interestingly, all of Ashfield's attributed frames were made in the high status and remarkable English Sunderland style. This frame is an ornamentally complete Sunderland, but carved on a small scale, and it's shown next to a larger Sunderland frame at Althorpe, which is about 3 times the size. Both of these frames are made in the same way, with his horizontal mason's miters that you might just be able to make out at the corners. And they're simply butted together. So the structure of the frame is provided by a joined back frame that you can't see at the moment. It's only since the 19th century that this frame pattern has been known as a Sunderland, and it's named after the 17th century collection at Althorpe, commissioned by Robert Spencer, 2nd Earl of Sunderland, where this type is prevalent. Based on the evidence of my images collection, I calculate that Sunderlands comprise half of the total extant auricular frames made between the 1630s and 1680. It seems that by associating his pastels with these most expensive of frames, Edmund helped to establish the high status of his work for sale. The lateral symmetry of the Sunderland pattern is characterised by its uniquely irregular sight edge around the canvas, line cartouche at top centre, winding scrolls at the top corners, complex series of foliate and rib reverse scrolls down either side and around the bottom corners, finally meeting at the mask at the bottom centre. The ornament flows seamlessly around the corners of the frames, and cut leather is evoked by overlapping motifs, folding, scrolling, and sometimes by the timber being pierced through. These frames have the auricular style's unsettling and abstract mixture of undulating silhouette, fleshy bodily forms, and beasts. The front frames of Sunderland frames are typically oak, but Ashfield small frames, like this one on the right, appear to be normally all of pine. However, on Ashfield's frame, instead of the typically irregular sight edge, that's contained within a concave moulding, probably due to problems of carving at this small scale. And the top and bottom cartouches are proportionately larger than the full-sized versions. This framed pastel by Edmund Ashfield of about 1672 is of Rebecca Clayton and is also Oxborough Hall, like the last slide. Mary's framed designs were soon simplified and became arguably more attractive for works on this scale. The frame side members are a little less cluttered now with ornament. This simplification of the Sunderland ornamentation for these small pastels suggests that the pattern first became established on the larger examples, and this frame is also over gilded. With the side view here, we can see that by physically examining the back of frames as much as possible, you can note and compare their construction. The detail at the top left shows the end of a cross-lap joint of the back frame, which is represented in the diagram at bottom left. All 4 members of the mason's mitered front frame are nailed onto this joined back frame through the front, which is standard to all Sunderland frames. Afterwards, they were decorated first by painting a proteinaceous chalk ground layer or gesso, then oil gilded over a buff coloured layer to create a solid appearance. There may well originally have been a thin coating applied over the gold leaf, unifying and slightly matting the gilding. This effect would have been of a harmonious surface of relatively matte gilding, glowing, and allowing the carving to shine without being too dazzling when appreciating the painting. This framed oil painting on panel at Hatchlands Park is described by the National Trust as being in the manner of Edmund Ashfield, of a man in armour, and is inscribed 1672. There are copies of other paintings by Edmund Ashfield in oil, but no certain originals by him in this medium are known. But as this frame is in the same pattern as on Ashfield's pastels, such as Rebecca Clayton, it also dated to 1672, it's perhaps reasonable to consider it likely this frame was also made by Mary, and it's again overgilded with its bottom mask having a considerable loss. Here's another similar example sold empty on eBay in 2020. The images show the front frame's horizontal mason's mitres nailed through the front onto the cross-lapped back frame. This is not the same as seen on a similar frame for Rebecca Clayton. The front frame appears to be, this is the same as seen on the similar frame for Rebecca Clayton, and the front frame appears to be pine and to have been over-gilded and partly stripped. Mary Ashfield continued making frames in this pattern, but the ornament of this example is simplified further as the centre of each side member by the removal of a scroll. This is Edmund Ashfield's pastel of Amphilis Tichborne, signed and dated Edmund Ashfield Feakett, 1674. The frame appears to have been over-gilded. 4 other similar examples of this further simplified pattern are known, and 3 are on pastels by Edmund Ashfield. The image on the left is James, 3rd Earl of Northampton, signed and dated EAF 1674, and is at Berkeley Castle. And on the right is Charles II of 1674 as well, also at Berkeley Castle. The rippling reflections are in what is possibly the original precious glass. These frames have not been physically examined, so it's unclear whether they've been over-gilded. The same frame pattern is on Edmund Ashfield's pastel of Sir James Oxenden, signed and dated 1674. Another containing a later mirror glass was sold at Battersea Antiques Fair in 2022. This frame has not been physically examined, so it's unclear whether it's been over-gilded, but there's a carving loss at top right. These framed Edmund Ashfield pastels were sold in 2022 at London's final Masterpiece Art Fair. They show a further development in Mary's designs away from the ornament of full-size Sunderlands, and both frames are made entirely of pine. The portraits were dated to about 1670, but further similar examples of these frames we'll see could date from the mid-1670s. So this pattern is clearly less datable, but one more frame pattern could have been made simultaneously by Mary's workshop, of course. And both frames here have been over-gilded and they're rather flaky. This image is a side detail of the top left corner of Charles II's frame and shows a wider back frame. It's partly concealed by gum strip, and it has a trimmed half-lap construction. As it's wider, there's also a scoop in the back frame, which can be seen at top right, to avoid the back frame covering the pierced ornament in the front frame, laying down. The hanging fittings are not original. This similar empty example is the one in the collection of the Art Gallery of Ontario, and it shows the same wide half-lap construction of the back frame and scoops, same as the last example, and it's made entirely of pine again and appears to have been over-gilded. Interestingly, this example of the same pattern with the same wide half-lap construction and scoops on the back frame, now reused with an oval spandrel for an earlier portrait of Prince Moritz of Nassau, has an oak front frame in contrast to the more usual pine used by Ashfield. This slide shows 4 from a set of 8 in the long gallery of similar framed pastels, possibly by Edmund Ashfield at Chirk Castle, 4 at either end. All probably date from the mid-1770s and are mostly after original paintings by Sir Peter Lely. And this pattern is characterized by a shallower top cartouche. Here is one of the set, and this is a portrait of Mary of Modena. I'll need to visit Chirk Castle again to better examine this set. I've been able to closely examine this similar example containing a later mirror frame, kindly allowed at Farley Prop Hire. Again, the front frame of this example is oak and the back frame is pine, and it's been over-gilded. An oblique view of this frame shows the wide back frame again with its half lap joint on the bottom left corner. It's a splayed shoulder in the half lap you might be able to see, seen towards the right, and each joint is secured by its original 3 handmade rosehead nails. The dating of this larger set of frames is less clear than the first ones I shown in this presentation, and some are seen on pastels by different pastelists. One quite similar frame is an oil on panel on a portrait of a bearded man in a fur cap, attributed to Edward Luttrell when recently sold by Olympia Auctions. That might be significant, as Luttrell was probably a student of Edmund Ashfield, so Mary making his frames would not be surprising. The frame has a similar wide half-lapped back frame as the last example, but this frame is made entirely of pine. It would be nice to know more about this similar example at the Rijksmuseum, which has been reused for an earlier portrait by Wybrandt van Geest. And it's another work on panel, certainly anachronistic. And a very unusual frame to indicate a note of caution here, as this frame at Berkeley Castle is also on a pastel attributed to Edmund Ashfield of Hans Holbein, date unknown, but it's certainly a very unique frame and relates to nothing we think we might understand of Mary or Edmund Ashfield's taste. So splendid though it might be, in the absence of having yet physically examined this frame, I'll say no more about it here. Similarly, the frame on Edmund Ashfield's portrait of John Maitland, 2nd Earl and 1st Duke of Lauderdale at Ham House, signed and dated EAF 1674-5, has apparently no link to Mary Ashfield's, as it is clearly a Dutch quab frame, but probably also dating from the mid-1670s. It is half-lapped gilded lime wood without a back frame, which is typical for Dutch construction, and it was presumably commissioned by John Maitland for this portrait. Mary Ashfield is entered in the City of London cash book as supplying 8 full-length picture frames to the Corporation of London in 1671 as part of a set of 22 full-length portraits by John Michael Rate of the fire judges who settled land disputes following the Great Fire of London in 1666. A painting of the Guildhall by William Miller, a century after the commission, shows the still overall gilded frames hung together. This is a page of the City Cash Book from Michaelmas 1671 to Michaelmas 1672, which has the main entry for Mary Ashfield. It's the 6th entry, and it says, paid Mary Ashfield for the frames of 8 of the pictures of the judges by order dated 14th of December 1671, £96, which is a good going rate. The page also lists other women and men being paid for various services and gives, as an aside, some interesting indications of women's activities and place within the city. The first entry is paid to Elizabeth Hill, widow, for findering of Elizabeth, the daughter and orphan of John Reynard, Skinner, £3.15. Skinner was John Reynard's trade guild, and there's many such entries throughout the period in the cash book for women being paid often considerable sums caring for children, which I presume this is. The 8th entry on this page says paid Thomas Knight Mason for work performed, again a man member of a trade guild. The 5th entry is paid Anne Pheasant for the remainder of £2,000 for her borrowed for the city's use. And the 2nd entry is James Brace, grocer, in the right of Deborah, his wife, £500. And this is James Brace receiving his wife's inheritance from her recently deceased parents. None of the women on this page have a trade guild listed after their names. Male frame makers would typically be members of the joiners' company. However, the earliest reference to a woman being given the freedom of the joiners' livery company is through patrimony in 1683, a little later. Between 1683 and 1812, there's only 26 women among thousands admitted as joiners by patrimony. I've been able to see 19 of the 22 fire judge frames and physically examine 12, which, together with the entries in the city cash book and photographs of those frames I've not seen, has enabled me to establish subsets of frames within the whole set, link these to the number of frames listed by the records to the 5 frame makers, and establish the makers of most of the frames, including the significantly large set of 8 by Mary Ashfield. One of Mary's now over-gilded frames for the commission was for the portrait of Sir John Archer, seen here. The whole set had horizontal mason's mitres in oak again in the front frames, and they were nailed onto pine back frames as before, joined by mortise and tenon, secured by long iron screws. Mary's group of 8 frames is stylistically and structurally clear, characterised by garlands either side of the top cartouche, tapering support bracket behind it, and the fairly human mask at the bottom centre. Interestingly, they follow a single frame commissioned by the city from John Norris, which was very slightly more. So he was presumably not returned to for his price unless he knew he was carving a prototype, which seems a bit rough. This slide shows the top crest of another of Mary's frames in the set, now in the collection of Arnold Wiggins. It was parcel gilded in the 1980s, and its painting's been destroyed. As a whole, the set was made of durable oak front frames, and they've always been admired as a type, so all of the frames have survived in some form. The subsets were established by comparing the design of the carved ornament, the supporting joinery of the cartouches, as well as the width and depth of the boards used to make up the front and back frames. This material evidence provided strong evidence to establish the subsets of frames and attribute them to their respective makers. The second woman frame maker listed in the city cash book is Mary Flashier for making 5 frames in 1671. I've also established the sitters for her frames, which includes the portrait of Sir Thomas Tyrrell, seen here. I've characterised these 5 frames made by Flashier by their bottom cartouches sweeping above the sight edge. The gilded slip frame is later. The whole set of 22 frames was overpainted with dark oak graining in 1824. Mary Beale's pocketbook of 1677, the female portraitist, has several entries itemising payment to the framemaker Tobias Fleshiers, a different spelling for gilt frames. And that suggests there might be a connection, but the spellings of surnames and no positive connection makes things very difficult. The third woman frame maker listed was Mary Dorrell for making 1 frame in 1672 to 3, specifically for the portrait of Samuel Brown, seen here. However, the one other frame of the 22 set, which was made by Heneage Finch, is listed as being made by Lawrence Dorville, a different sentence, but tantalizingly similar surname. So there are many coincidences in terms of people with similar spellings of their surnames in related professions in London at this point. The stylistic and technical evidence indicates that each of the 3 frame makers used different joiners and carvers, indicating that separate workshops included all of these skills, although were subcontracted out to different specialists. As Mary Ashfield made some of the very smallest and largest carved Sunderland frames, it's reasonable to assume that she also made them in other typical sizes in between, especially the most numerous 50 by 40 inch formal format for 3/4 length portraits. I've not yet been able to reliably match her to any of these other examples. The presence on Edward Ashfield's pastels of frames of varying design, timber and construction could point to his use of different workers or firms. However, as Mary Ashfield was able to carry out such large commissions as for the fire judges, it seems likely she would have been able to support most of his framing requirements. Indeed, Mary seems to have produced the majority of this small type of Sunderland frame, as the few patterns discussed here form the overwhelming majority of known examples and were probably originally used on pastel portraits in the main. We've been able to see the development of the Sunderland style for small portraits over a period of 6 or so years. There remains very much more to understand about what appears to be Mary Ashfield's very short but definitely professional career, which presently exactly corresponds to Edmund Ashfield's career. So she seems likely to have run a workshop for several people or contracted out. So did women frame makers emerge when the trade was expanding quickly after the restoration of Charles II in 1660? If this is so, then it took only a few years for them to be quickly replaced by male relatives or other competition. The set of frames demonstrated the importance of understanding frames as part of painting's provenance. Similarly, by learning more about the people who made the frames, including perhaps surprisingly several women in this case, we can better understand the dynamics of societies of the past. Thank you very much.
Well, Gerry, thank you very much for that fascinating talk. And you touched there on techniques and a lot of overgilding. And as framers, I know we all like the sight of the back of the frame and the construction as well. So that's part of our trade, isn't it? So thank you very much for that fascinating talk. Next, we're handing over to Géraldine Bidault from Géraldine is the librarian at the Musée National du Chateau de Versailles, and she's in charge of 18th century paintings and drawings, but also the collection of antique frames as well, or ancient frames, and in charge of documentary studies of those frames. And since 2021, she started a documentation project to document the frames from the 16th to the 19th centuries, which is so important, documentation of frames. So over to you, Géraldine, with your paper on notable bordures of the 18th century from the Versailles Palace. Thank you.
Okay, so good evening or good morning, it depends. Today I will talk about some notable bordures of the 18th century from the Palace of Versailles. At the beginning of the 18th century, the Abbé Dubost evoked the question of framing in these terms. The industry of men has found some ways to turn paintings more capable of making a great impression on us. They are enclosed in gilded bordures, which throw a new glaze on the color. Among the 2,500 frames preserved at the Palace of Versailles, there are about 30 stamped or attributed so-called bordures executed in the 18th century. So during this presentation, we will first look at the notion of bordure and the method used to identify sculptors. Then we will talk about the commissions for the royal portraits. And finally, we will focus on some remarkable bordures of the Palace of Versailles. During the Renaissance, the bordure was first a botanical term that referred to the line of plants planted along the path. But starting from the 17th century, it defined a gilded wooden ornament surrounding a mirror, a painting, a drawing, a woven or engraved work. Thus, long before the generalization of the term cadre, which means frame, which appeared by the middle of the 18th century, notably in the account books of the Marchand Mercier, so the supplier to Madame de Pompadour, Lazare Duvaux. The presentation, the protection, and ornamentation of a two-dimensional work of art was ensured by a bordure. The lexicographer Jean-François Ferraud stated in 1787 that the term frame was only used for small paintings or poor and petty bordure. Throughout the period, the importance given to the bordure and their ornaments continued to increase, and sometimes even to the detriment of the painting. Thus, at the Painting Salon, which is an exhibition of paintings of 1753, the Abbé Leblanc protested against the exaggerated importance of this accessory by saying, "This will not," I quote, "this will not prevent the richness of the bordure from striking the viewer more than the excellence of the painting." And it's true that some bordure costed almost as much as the painting they were surrounding. For instance, in September 1739, André Tremblin delivered for £850 a bordure for the portrait of Louis XV, copied by François Thiémard after Hyacinthe Rigaud. Picture paid £900. As a matter of fact, most of the bordures sculpted during the 18th century were limited to the portraits and especially the royal portraits. But by the time of the Regency, some inexpensive compositional bordures were also produced in paste and not in wood, notably by the craftsman Delaunay. The entry bordure in Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopedia mentioned several types: a rich bordure, a common bordure, a bordure of burnished gold, matte gold, etc. And in 1729, Jacques Savary des Brulons described almost something like 50 shades of bordure: plain gilt bordure, Roman bordure, cartouche bordure, bordure with simple corners, with corners and middles, and so on. Any sculptor of the Academy of Saint-Luc, which brought together master painters and sculptors, could make and sell frames, and this activity became the main one for the majority of them during the 18th century. Some painters, including Maurice Quentin de la Tour and Jean-Marc Natier, even took a close interest in the frames of some of their paintings. For instance, the sculptor Louis Morissan counted in his 1748 account book the time for the designs made, the drawings, made for the bordure of Louis XV and Marie Leczinska portraits, and one of these drawings was made by Mr. de la Tour. So the identification of the Versailles Palace 18th century bordure and their correspondent sculptures requires not only an examination of styles, of the reverse of the stamps, but also a real research on the various archival documents produced by the royal administration, as well as an in-depth study and transcription of the sculptors' account books kept in the National Archives. This work was made possible first and foremost thanks to the research and expertise of the curators Bruno Pons, Christian Bollez, as well as Yves Carlier and Bertrand Rondeau, but also thanks to the 10-year inventory campaign of the frame storage in Versailles carried out between 2019 and 2021 by my colleague Marine Mazur-Vetter. Since 2022, and thanks to the help of 3 interns, we have at Versailles a documentation entirely dedicated to frames from the 16th to the 20th centuries, reflecting the scope of the collections. and a close collaboration with Céline Blondel, Laura Jean Triolet, and Alice Tronche, our gilded wood restorers, is also much necessary for dating frames and wood. The observation of the assemblies, as well as the oxidation of the wood, the quality, the diversity of the carving, and the so-called reparure that will be evoked by Marie Dubost afterwards, the quality of gold, the gilding technique are all valuable clues for us. For instance, the restoration of this carved oak, frame gilded with tempera, assembled by fleur-de-lis brackets, which currently frames a portrait of the Duc de Bourgogne, has made it possible to refine its dating, so between 1700 and 1730. So, as you now know, royal portrait bordure was the richest during the 18th century. And the richness of the bordure, of the sculpture of the bordure, is a function of the importance of the recipient of the mark of esteem that accompanies the royal gift. For the Crown of France, these bordures were ordered by 3 different administrations, the Bâtiment du Roi, or King's Works, the Menu Plaisir, or King's Entertainment, and the Department of Foreign Affairs. So among the sculptors who executed bordure for the royal portraits for this administration, in addition to Pierre-François Beaumont, were also Honoré Guibert, François-Charles Buteux, and François-Joseph Duret. By Guibert, we know the bordure made for the portrait of Louis XV and gilded by Médard Brancourt, a tapestry by the Gobelins executed in 1771 by the workshop of Pierre-François Cosette after a painting by Louis-Michel Van Loo, placed in the Queen's Grand Cabinet in 1773 at Versailles. Yes. Yes, okay. At Versailles, only 3 frames are firmly attributed to Buteux, the official sculptor of the bordure of the reign of Louis XVI, in light of the element present in the artist's account book. We can mention in particular the one surrounding the portrait of Marie Leczinska by Nattier, offered by the Queen to her first butler, the Marquis de Chalmazel, as we can see here, in 1762, frame that has been gilded once again during the 19th century by Souty. And this frame has been rediscovered thanks to the inventory campaign and the transcription of the account book by our intern Geneviève Xolin. The bordure published by Bruno Pons, probably executed in 1773 and 1774 by Jean-François Boulanger for the bordure, and François-Joseph Duret for the figure of the children, the tiger and the dew, then gilded by Jean-Gilles Ramier and Jean-Félix Vatin, is kind of the Mona Lisa of our frame collection in Versailles. This frame has an history because it was found out at the Édouard Grosvalet Frame Gallery in Paris by the curator of Versailles, Charles Morichaud-Beaupré, who brought it and donated it to the museum on June 1945. And as you can see, this bordure now frames a portrait of Marie Antoinette after Louise-Élisabeth Vigée-Lebrun. And this frame was committed for a former portrait of the Queen. And unfortunately, not all the frame of royal portraits have been found out or identified, and many of the ones commissioned for Versailles have disappeared or were dispersed after the French Revolution. So to balance these shortcomings, drawings are a very valuable source of knowledge for us. For example, the bordure with the arms of Marie Antoinette now lost, missing, now missing, commissioned to Bidault by the Comte de Vergennes, who was then the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, is known by its preparatory drawing, now kept at the Musée Lambinet in Versailles. So in addition to the portraits, the Versailles collection includes bordures related to the display of the palace paintings in the king's state apartment, such as those made for two monumental paintings by Paolo Veronese, The Feast at the House of Simon and Eliezer and Rebecca, both presented in the Hercules room and executed by the time of the renovation of the room at the beginning of the reign of Louis XV. The first original bordure was designed, the first one for the Feast at the House of Simon, was designed and sculpted by François-Antoine Vassé and transferred afterwards from the Louvre, the Grande Galerie, from the Galerie d'Apollon at the Louvre to Versailles between October and December 1729, at the same time as the painting, then set up in the Hercules room on December 1729 and gilded by Guillaume Desosiers in January 1730. The second bordure was designed by François-Antoine Vassé around 1729 and then executed by Verbergt because Vassé died after the drawing of Vassé in 1736 at the end of the ceiling decoration of the Hercules room by François Lemoine. Another standout pair of frames is the one presented in the Mars room. These original bordures have been commissioned to Bidault in 1786 by Louis Durameau, who was a painter and at the same time the curator in charge of the royal collections, before being delivered. Those two bordures were delivered around 1789, so really by the end of the reign of Louis XVI, to surround two paintings from the Louis XIV collection, The Queens of Persia at the Feet of Alexander by Charles Lebrun, and The Supper at Emmaus by Paolo Veronese. In addition to the layout of the rooms, the choice of bordure is also motivated by the subject depicted. Claude-Philippe Cailleux, who was an emulator of Guibert and Jean-François Eubène, executed a bordure with naturalistic patterns, as you can see, and this bordure was commissioned by the Queen in 1753, to frame the painting she had just executed. This very original bordure, now on display in the Dauphin apartment, is composed of oak branches, as you can see here, acorns and snakes. I don't know if you can see the snakes here, for instance. And there is also a dragon attacking a bird at the top. Finally, I would like to mention 5 rare bordures made by the Slot brothers to frame the prince by Charles-Nicolas Cochin, executed for the marriage of the Dauphin Louis de France with the Infanta of Spain on February of 1745. So according to the Slot's account book, 2 types of bordure were made: 36 simple bordure and 160 so-called rich bordure. In Versailles, 4 simple bordures are preserved, and they are made of stemples and a knot of ribbon on the top rail. And the fifth bordure, acquired recently in 2022, is part of the bordure distributed to the Court of France and other courts. And each of these rich bordures was truly unique because each member of the workshop of the Slots Brothers had interpreted the design given by the masters. So in conclusion, I would like to say that the royal and remarkable bordure represents the quintessence of the Versailles Palace collection of frames. And the research into the collection of bordure, as well as the identification of the sculptors who worked for the royal administration, remains investigation with many enigmas. The dispersal of the collection by the end of the Ancien Régime, the different provenances and the different displays complicate the identification of these artists whose commissions, stamps, and styles gradually come to be known. By virtue of the advance of the knowledge about their history, it is to be hoped that frames will no longer be considered just as essential accessories, but as works of art in their own right. Thank you for your attention.
Well, Géraldine, thank you very much for that fascinating presentation and a really kind of groundbreaking work, I think, at the Versailles Palace in just documenting the frames as collections and look how you've managed to reunite frame and painting in some instances. So that's really a great work, and thank you for that fascinating paper. So next, staying with French frames, we now have Marie Dubost, who's a freelance conservator with over 3 decades of experience as a conservator of gilded and painted wood furniture and picture frames. And she's now going to talk to us on the skill of the Reparure in Western Europe. So over to you, Marie. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Michael, and thank you also for the Art Gallery of Ontario for allowing me to talk about my research topic on the recutting. In French, reparure. In this presentation, I'm going to use a lot of French technical terms because their translation simply doesn't exist. For example, reparure is based on the action of scraping and not cutting into the gesso. In France, gilders have developed a technique that provides such delicate definition that it has become an art recognized through Europe for its beauty and refinement. Situated between the art of sculpture and the art of chiseling, reparure is the action of repairing and redefining a carved surface that has been covered by a gesso. It becomes an art when it highlights volumes, makes them more dynamic or supple, enriches ornament backgrounds, and marks the style used. To take an interest in this technique is to try to associate it with the different styles that today allows us to identify the dating of gilded objects. La reparure plays an important role in creating gloss and matte areas that contribute to the elegance of gilded surfaces. In this presentation, I'd like to talk about the base to where the recutting is applied, how the material is worked, the types of tools used, how this process helps to establish the different gloss values that can be observed in water gilding. Then I will look more closely at the reparure of certain styles the evolution of its representation, and its implementation through the tool marks used. The aim will be to associate Reparure with the historical and artistic context of the various styles representative of the 18th century French decorative repertoire. The work of wood gilders is closely linked to that of wood carvers. For gold to be beautiful, it must be deposited on a surface smooth enough for light to reflect. The gilder must therefore cover the wood with a fine coating. In the process, he fills the hollows in the wood carving, erasing details and modifying certain volumes. This is why the wood carving to be coated is not finished by the wood carver, but by the gilder. A water gilding wood surface is composed as follows: wood covered with a gesso, a yellow color to imitate gold in areas that are difficult to gild, a clay layer which allows the metal leaf to be burnished. Here's an example of 18th century wood carving that has practically lost its gilding. It's easy to see the difference between the wood carving here on the left, once the wood has been coated, reparé, and gilded on the right side. You see all those details. They are not on the wood. It is the gilder who did that. The details added to the wood carving's background, known as jeu de fond, and to the acanthus leaves, known as bretté, a part of the reparure. Here are the jeu de fond, and the bretté are all those lines here. The quality of the gesso and different application techniques have a large influence on the desired effect, matte or gloss. When the gilder uses a sponge or damp cloth to smooth a surface, he prepares an area which, once gilded, will have a very matte finish. When he uses fine sandpaper or a scraper, he compacts the material and makes it denser, preparing it to become glossier. In the same way, a wood surface coated with a thin layer of whitening of gesso will always produce a more matte finish than a surface coated with a thick gesso that can be worked to become dense and glossy. When the gilder applies his coating, he must already know what final finish he wants to achieve. He will place more coats on the parts that will be worked with the tool to achieve the reparure, and those that will be burnished. The man who is doing la reparure is named le repareur. He uses tools called fer à reparer. Their shapes vary according to their use. Un fer à reparer is a tool consisting of a bent, pressed in metal rod with a round, flat, or hollow head, convex or concave. The tool is sharpened to scrape into the gesso, not to cut it, like a wood carver's gouge into the wood. To do this, the edge of the iron is sharpened with a fine whetstone at a fairly open angle. When the metal is crushed, you create a small burr here called a morphil. It is this sharpening morphil that enables the tool to dig into the material. The fer à refendre here and the fer plat there, can be used to redefine the edges of shapes and carving backgrounds. Les fers ronds are used to create decorative patterns in flowers, leaves, hairs, and feathers. They are called filets or brettés. Here are some examples of what it is: a fillet, like a line here, and those are the brettés, all those lines. Other tools are used to smooth the surface of reliefs and to shape forms. In this example, the sliding iron, fer à refendre, first redefines the contour of the plastron shapes. Then the side irons, les fers de côté, shape the surfaces, smoothing out imperfections and creating fine details. Here is the fer de côté. Gestures can be more dynamic, like the fer rond used to mark flower petals or leaf veins. In the case of these flowers, the bretté allowed us out by the tool will be matte, with the surface left behind will be burnished. It is up to the repareur to choose whether to create small, large, wide, or allow bretté, which will be well marked or just suggested, which will leave room for numerous burnished areas, or on the contrary, create a completely matte surface. Look at the grain d'orge here. This grain d'orge is the name of this pattern. The grain d'orge decoration on the background of the ornament, the idea is to create a surface made of numerous small diamonds, shaped lozenges, to simulate their volumes. To do this, hold the tool at a slight angle, here, this angle, to that the mark left is in the gesso is more accentuated on one side, creating a shadow zone depending on the light. Here the light, and here is a shadow there, and the white part. The shadow zone will simulate a black line, while the light zone will create a white line around a small diamond. Hence the illusion of trompe-l'œil volume accentuated by the very matte rendering of the grain d'orge and the burnished effect of the check pattern. In the same way, les brettés on this example of acanthus leaf are particularly strong on one side to create a more dynamic volume. We could also use a fer rond with a slightly more closed curve on one side to create a stronger halo. By observing and understanding the shape of the tools used, the importance of tool strokes in priming and the importance of matte and burnished, we become to the idea that reading Reparure can help us recognize the period of an object. Let's take a few examples to explain what we mean. The French decorative repertoire under the reign of Louis XIV was characterized by a sense of strength, power, representation, and glory. Nothing was too good to enrich the ornamental and sculptural register, which had to match the king's ambition and grandeur. This period is defined by an important central power that imposes a way of thinking, be it religion or political, strong, on rigor and magnificence. The acanthus leaf is strong and powerful in the Baroque style. The fretwork in linear and orderly. They leave plenty of room for the spaces intended to be burnished in keeping with the light represented by the king known as le roi soleil. The backgrounds of the sculpture are richly engraved with jeux de fond that reveal each other in the inventiveness of their geometry shapes, highlighted by the play of matte and burnished. In this example, we can see that very few tools are used to the reparure. A small fer rond here, and the small fer rond to draw the contour and fillet of the background set, and a larger fer rond here, the larger one, for the bretté on the leaves and flowers. Here, a Louis XIV acanthus leaf repaired with the two fer ronds, as well as all the background sets on this exercise sheet. In this example of the Louis XIV decor, the brilliance of the gold is clearly seen in the play of jeux de fond that emphasizes the lines. The grandeur and richness of the decor is also reflected in the reparure, which covers every surfaces in a very tidy and disciplinary manner. Large areas are burnished here. In later period, only accents were burnished. When King Louis XIV died in 1715, the future King Louis XV was just 5 years old. La Régence was a very short period during which the French court relaxed considerably and moved to new, smaller homes in Paris. Small salons and boudoirs made their appearance. People lived much more freely, with a particular emphasis on refinement and elegance. La reparure also becomes more flexible. The tool stroke widens very slightly, but overall, they become more dynamic in the way that they are made. The iron begins by gently entering the whiting, the gesso, then very quickly widen at the start of the leaf. It then runs toward the center of joints, all the brettés, to form a single dynamic rib. These acanthus leaves are like flowers. Instead of being simply placed next to each other, they are tented at the base, giving them an upward thrust, as if lifted them from their background. The librettés are done in the same way, deeper on one side to create a zone of light and shadow to accentuate each volumes. Tools change. Les fers à reparer are still round, but start to vary its roundness and size. They become more oval. This has the effect of giving more force to each repair stroke. Each bretté is like a drop, a comma, which ends up in a central rib. This reparure has the effect of being very dynamic. Digging in front of relief tends to make it lift even more. Remember the grain d'orge with the iron stroke slightly titled to create black and white. Here it's the same thing, but the mark can be wider. Un bretté can start out light, small, and on the surface, then gradually work its way toward the center of the acanthus leaf, widening and deepening. It lifts the shape, accentuating its relief and giving it more life. Under Louis XV, philosophy was light and sensual. It obeys all the whims that contribute to the enjoyment and pleasure of morals. It rejects order, several lines, simplified forms, and sober details. It seeks a certain softness that produces sensual pleasures. The curve reigns over all powerful. Motifs are distended, undulating, moving away from any idea of symmetry, taking their inspiration from the auricular style, which tends to distort shapes like the human ear. This trend led to the Rococo style. The shapes of the fer à reparer are round, in all width and depth. Everything is done to take the pattern stand out from their base, amplifying the curves of the motifs and energizing the movement. Engraved backgrounds are increasingly given way to much simpler matte backgrounds, highlights by bold, sweeping molding, and the strong contrast between matte and burnish areas. Libretti are more numerous and decorations. They start closer to the edge of the leaves and no material is left between each bretté. The burnished areas are still very present, clearly visible through their roundness. Around 1750, the popularity of neoclassicism soared. A search for simplicity and calm spread through the clientele. Rocaille motifs and flower elements begin to disappear, giving way to more sober, stylized creations. Appreciate for their form and the extreme discretion of their decoration. The taste for the antiques resurfaced with an unprecedented concern for precision and fineness. The reign of Louis XVI produced an incredible quantity of objects, including works of exceptional quality, of recutting, of reparure, that still stand out today. Under Louis XVI, it is clear that the woodcarver expresses his skill to the point of perfection in terms of detail and finesse of volume. In a way, the gilder must now adapt his work to that on the woodcarver. He will have to use finer gesso to avoid obscuring the volumes, while at the same time depositing enough gesso to allow a reparure that meets the criteria of finesse and perfection demanded by the period. It's a question, for example, of drawing those leaf ribs that are only a few tenths of millimeters in size, of creating subtle uplights at the edges of the leaf to suggest the illusion that it's lifting. Everything must be elegant and fragility. The motifs are no longer approximate, but realistic to an incredible degree. The carving details are very precise. but we appreciate the gilder's skill in applying a reasonable amount of gesso so as not to obscure the details. Numerous new tools shapes are naturally required to meet the needs of this new reparure. Since all reliefs are softened, we need some fer à reparer that can work on all surfaces. In order to shape them, you have fer mi-plat, fer rond, fer plat, fer à refendre, le fer de côté, ici encore, here also, and fer carré. This new way of doing reparure sees the disappearance of brettés and backgrounds. Only the ribs and raised edges of the leaves are left in volumes, but they must never be heavy. The veins of the leaf fade away to allow suggestion. La reparure at the end of the reign will, in a way, fade into the background, allowing the wood carving to show all its power. This very brief introduction to the art of reparure is intended to show that gilding is not simply the presence of a metal leaf on a carved surface. Our gaze must also focus on the wood carving reparure and the choice of rendering a different and various gloss value to metal. The 18th century in France is exemplary in this respect. Initial research into old documents shows a surprising lack of description in this area. Maybe Monsieur Solo in 1886 and Paul Fleury in 1908 describe it better than I never could. La reparure is done on a variety of ways, depending on the craftsman's skill, knowledge of drawing and feeling for sculpture. You need to have a basic understanding of drawing first, and ornaments mainly. Not everyone is a good appreciator, and many people are content with a repareur who cuts his whites well. But a connoisseur will rightly prefer the work of a workman who cuts less well, but just where it's needed, and who won't make a dent where there would be a volume. Le repareur is rightly considered the artist of the guild, and no other specialist enjoy such a well-deserved reputation. La reparure is the most beautiful, the most skillful, and the most artistic of operations. This research is the fruit of over 30 years of experience, and the Getty Foundation grant has helped me to put this in writing. There is so much more to be said, but all about this underappreciated art form, to consider gilding in relation to other disciplines such as sculpture, punching, chasing bronzes, etc., but also in the light of politics, poetry, and philosophy. Many thanks to many people.
Well, Marie, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation and sharing your long career of experience at almost, it's so enlightening today, to see almost an obsessive attention to surface detail when so much is so slight in our world. But the work of the repareur is almost poetic.
Yes.
And you can you can see almost the way that the pulling motion of cutting in a soft gesso is more fluid than the pushing motion of the carver in a hard wood.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much. I think everybody
Thank
was
you.
informed by that presentation.
Thank you so much, Marie, Gerry, and Geraldine, and Michael for that wonderful moderation. We appreciate that so much. Thanks for being here. We will see you all in about 30 minutes.
Thank you.